the coronavirus God's judgment on us? It's a question that's being voiced repeatedly, and it's one that even if we don't say it out loud, it's at the back of the mind of many Christians. We remember, for example, the plagues that God brought on Egypt in the time of Moses as punishment for enslaving the nation of Israel, and we wonder to ourselves, is it our turn now? Is it our turn to be punished? The problem with that approach is that in the wrong hands it can be used as a tool for condemning anyone whom the preacher chooses. If we think we're being punished, the next question would be, for what are we being punished? And that opens the door to all kinds of evil. No doubt you'll have heard a number of minority groups being blamed for all kinds of tragedies over the years. We forget that the times in the Bible when God brings judgment are almost always intended so that people change their ways. It's far more sensible then to think in terms of consequences and promises, and so that's what we're going to explore this time, as we look at the end of the story of Noah and the ark and a rainbow, since there's a lot in this story to mirror our current circumstances and hopefully to put to rest that this is divine judgment. So we're going to split this up into 3 chunks with a few thoughts after each one. This first bit comes from Genesis chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, and every animal, every creeping thing and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out of the ark by families. One of the problems with the flood story is that the first question most people ask is, so did it happen? There is a body of opinion that something happened in the Middle East in deep time that spawned a number of flood myths like this across the people of the region. But the far more important question for us is not did it happen, but what does it mean? There's a context to the flood that we often miss, and that is that in many ways it's the 3rd creation story. The first one was the 7-day creation, the second was Adam and Eve, and this is the 3rd one. It's the remaking of creation. To understand what I mean by that, you need a tiny bit of ancient Middle Eastern cosmology. So here's a picture of the universe. It's a bit smaller than ours. They believed that the earth was flat, and above the earth was a dome that God fixed in place to divide the waters above from the waters below. And the waters were symbols of chaos. That's from the first creation story, which, contrary to popular opinion, it's not about God creating something out of nothing, but God bringing order out of chaos. So, they believed, we live on a flat land and all the seas are chaos that come up from below, and when it rains it's God opening the windows in the dome to allow more waters of chaos to come through. That's why the sky is blue, because water is blue. Now, okay, this seems like a nonsense to us, but it's what they believed, and it's what makes sense of the ark story. God felt that humans had polluted his creation, so he decided to return it to chaos by letting the waters of chaos back in order that he could start again. And that's what makes sense of the line of God making a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed, the rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. The wind, the breath, the Spirit echoes the first creation story of the Spirit brooding over the unformed chaos. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven are the gateways to chaos which God closes up. Creation has been wiped clean, and now it's time to start again. And of course that has significance for us because they were in lockdown as well, just like we are. In the Noah's story, however, we assume that the flood is definitely a sign of God's judgment. But is it? Actually, when you start to look at it, what you see in Genesis 6 verse 6 is that God's heart has been broken by humanity. Nothing that God did, from showing mercy to Adam and Eve and then showing mercy to their son Cain, even after he'd killed his brother, and on down the generations, nothing that God did could stem the evil. So God decided, not out of anger or vengeance, but out of sorrow, that God would start again, preserving a remnant like seeds for a new creation. Now, I know I'm telling this as if it were history. We need to remember it's a folk tale handed down for generations before being written and recorded. The truth is more in the subject than in the history behind it. That's where we can burrow deep to investigate whether the coronavirus is God's judgment on us. So let's have a look at the second part of the reading. This comes from later on in Genesis chapter 8. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelt the pleasing odour, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I've done. Okay, there's an irony here. Noah has saved loads of animals, all now vulnerable to extinction in this story, and then he sacrifices some of them. Don't forget, this is myth story, not history. But I find this to be one of the most curious verses in the Bible. It's as if God has realised there's nothing more that he could do about our species. After everything that God has done in terms of creating, destroying and recreating, because God has given us free will, humanity will always have the freedom to destroy rather than build, to exploit rather than to work with. The writer is essentially recording what looks like a divine revelation. It's God's own epiphany. God can't change our species. In this one verse, we have the first step on the divine pathway towards the cross and the Easter story of how God chooses therefore to come and be one of us and suffer with and for us so that we can draw near once again to what God always intended for us. But the absolutely vital part of this, the key, is the promise that God makes here. I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. That's the answer we need to hear when we ask if this is God's judgment, this coronavirus is God's curse on us. The answer is no, because God says that God will never do that to us again. There's a but, though. We remember that God is also a parent who must teach God's children. And all good parents try to teach their children that the choices that they make and the actions that they take, they all have consequences and they have to live with the consequences. So this understanding which God comes to is not the end of the story, because something that God goes on to teach repeatedly through the Bible is that actions have consequences. One of the clearest warnings comes from Hosea chapter 8 verse 7. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. We are the ones responsible for what happens. Now, I don't think there's any mileage whatsoever in these conspiracy theories about Chinese laboratories letting a virus escape. But there is an interesting body of opinion, an important body of opinion, emerging in scientific circles that the reason this virus has reached the human species is because of the ways that we've been treating the natural world. In a study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society Bee Journal, it reads, human encroachment into biodiverse areas increases the risk of spillover of novel infectious diseases by enabling new contacts between humans and wildlife. Spillover of viruses from animals are a direct result of our actions involving wildlife and their habitat, said lead author Christine Croyder-Johnson. Other voices are saying similar things. This is not nature's revenge, we did it to ourselves, said leading US scientist Thomas Lovejoy, who coined the phrase biodiversity back in the 1980s. And he blames the illegal wildlife trade and our excessive intrusion into nature. Essentially, our exploitation of nature reduces the spaces that other species have in which to live. So they try to survive in our spaces, and therefore we are driven into ever closer contact with other species carrying their own viruses, which can seem then more easily able to jump to our species. The coronavirus is not judgment from God, but it seems likely that it is a consequence of our treatment of the world. And it's that treatment that comes under close scrutiny in the final part of the reading. And this is from Genesis chapter 9. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I will make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh." There are two key things for us to see here. First, that God is making his covenant promise with all of creation. And second, there are no terms to this covenant that our species has to fulfill. It's an unconditional promise. It's not a promise that is dependent on our actions. And then to underline everything that I've said about this not being God's judgment, there is a rainbow. Now remember, a bow is a weapon of war. It's held vertically in tension so that arrows can be released. But God lays his many-coloured divine bow on its side in the clouds, declaring that he will not wage war on creation, but instead that he enters an unconditional covenant promise relationship with all of creation. God lays down his weapon and declares peace. The upshot of this is that when we cause the natural world to rebel against us, it's because we are tampering with a covenant promise made by God. That's got consequences, not in terms of God judging us and sending the virus as a judgment. Don't forget, there are numerous other diseases killing tens of thousands of people every year, especially in the developing world. So although this horrendous suffering that our species is going through is not God's judgment on us, we should consider carefully whether it is happening because God made a promise to all of creation and we are violating that promise by how we treat the planet. God chooses not to destroy in judgment, but we do choose to destroy through exploitation. That violation has all sorts of negative outcomes, such as global warming, the extinction of species, the loss of habitat in the ironic name of progress. But more than that, this exploitation leaves us open to the consequences of our actions. So what should be our response? Remember what I said back over Easter. Christ came not just for humanity, but for all creation. That's a continuation of this promise God made all the way back in deep myth time. So we who follow that way share the same duty of care for creation and a need to honour it as a gift of which we are a part. The promise of God is to lay down his bow and make peace with us and all creation. This is what he ultimately did through Christ. Just as there are consequences for our disobedience, so there should be good outcomes for creation when we receive God's gift, that we live it out in the world by caring for all creation and helping all species to be the best that they can be. Right now we're in enforced lockdown. As we watch the pollution levels dropping. We notice birdsong to somehow seem louder. That's why I'm out here today rather than in my study. The skies are clearer. We can breathe more easily. For the first time ever here in my walk across the fields last week, the air tasted as fresh as the ocean breeze. I've been here 14 years, never noticed that before. Maybe this is the time to think more deeply about how we can respond to God laying down the divine bow, the rainbow. If God refuses to make war on us, perhaps it's time for us to stop making war on the creation God put into our care. The love of God will not let us go, and we can respond to that by loving the creation God gave us. So how can you and I do that?